This Short Code podcast is a proud member of the MedEd Media Network. Inspiration, information, and guidance on your journey to medical school and beyond at mededmedia.com.
Meandering in the margins of medicine, it's the Short Code podcast.
Weird news,
fresh views,
helpful clues, and interviews.
By students, for students.
Subscribe to our weekly show at theshortcode.com.
Welcome back to the Short Code Podcast, a production of the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine. I'm Nick Lind. We've ditched Dave again. I think I lost him in the hospital somewhere. With me today are some more wonderful CCOM parents. From the interwebs, we have rising M3, Sally Heaberlin.
Hi.
And in the studio, we have rising M2, Katie Higham-Kessler.
Hello.
And are you a rising? You're kind of like M1, M2, somewhere in between.
Somewhere in between.
That's cool.
Close enough.
And rising M3, Jessica De Haan.
Woohoo! Hey, guys.
Rising M4, Zach Tully.
How's it going?
Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to have this conversation today. So I kind of want to just jump in and have you guys introduce yourselves. Does somebody want to start?
I'll start. This is Jess. So my story, I'm definitely a non-traditional. I went from undergrad into PA school and then worked as a PA. And then my husband and I, we met while I was working as a PA, got married. And then when I'm 29, I start thinking like, oh, maybe I should have gone to medical school, which I'm not saying being a PA was the wrong thing. It was just my goals changed. And so I talked to him about that, like, hey, would this be crazy? And he said, no, I'll support you. But caveat, we were also at the same stage of life where we wanted to start having kids because I was like knocking on 30. And so he's like, as long as you don't make us wait to have children, I'll be all for this. And I was like, well, how are we going to do that? He's like, we'll figure it out. And I also had a very dear friend, a physician friend, who encouraged me to go for it because she's like, yeah, it never gets easier. I wish I had kids in medical school. So we embarked on that. I got into medical school here at University of Iowa. And then a few months later found out I was pregnant. And so didn't really ask permission, just like said, I'm just going to matriculate. They'll figure it out that I'm pregnant eventually. And so that journey was very interesting because they hadn't previously had a female student start medical school pregnant. I'd even heard rumors that like before they were encouraged to delay matriculation a year. And I understand there's a lot of concerns. You know, you have the formaldehyde and anatomy lab and some teratogenic exposure there. And so I just said, okay, I'm going to get a respirator. And every little thing was like, well, how are you going to do that? I just found a solution for. So I looped in the counselor, med student counseling office at my school, met with the dean, met with the curriculum coordinators, and there was just a lot of like, we'll figure this out as we go. And so then over my Christmas break, I had the baby 5 days before the spring semester started. And that was really stressful, of course. Everyone in the hospital looked at me like I was insane because rumor got out that I was a med student. I think one person asked me. And then after that, every single person who came into my L&D room was like, I hear you're the med student, which highly recommend you don't let people know you're a medical student when you're in labor, because then everyone just like walks on eggshells around you, treats you differently. It was kind of a weird experience, actually. So I started, and that first week I had a pretty severe complication from my delivery, and I just like could not sit, walk, stand. So that first week I just stayed home from classes. And then the second week I came in like for only the very minimal required things, like neuroanatomy lab and some small group discussions. But thankfully, because of our lectures being recorded, I could do a lot of that from home. And then they started saying, okay, you know, hey, it's been like, we're going to give you about 6 weeks of some of that flexibility where you can do the minimal amount of things on campus. So, you know, coming, of course, for a test. And so right in February is when I started coming on campus more regularly for things and pumping milk. And that was just really difficult, you know, because I would leave in the morning. By the time you like leave, get parked, walk in, you know, and everything. And then you just stay throughout the whole day and then you come home. I wouldn't get to spend as much time with my little one. And then, you know, you fall asleep studying because you're exhausted. And what magically made my life so much easier was this horrible pandemic, because then suddenly we had so much more flexibility. It was such a blessing in disguise. And I know this has been awful for many people and for many parents who with school age children. It's been very difficult. I was not in that category. I was in the category of being like, man, it would be wonderful if I could just do med school at home. And that's exactly what I got.
Yeah.
And so I then in March until the rest of the year was able to spend like the whole year at home with him. And I had a fantastic experience, and we can talk about this a little bit more, but I feel like one of the things that we have really yielded from this virtual learning and work from home experience is to realize we can have more flexibility. We can still be productive. We can still get a quality education. And in the meanwhile, really have a more enjoyable experience with our loved ones. And it's not for everyone or for all seasons, but for that period of my life, it was a lifesaver.
That's amazing. It's amazing how much of a mixed blessing COVID ended up being for you and your family. And we talked a little bit about this during the last episode. I hope one thing we can get out of COVID and all of the virtual learning is maybe it will be a lot easier for people in unique situations and
absolutely
in medical school and beyond to be able to participate in things that had to be in person in the past.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And obviously you can't take a cadaver home with you for your dissections. You still got to come in for some of those preclinical years things. Totally agree with that.
Yeah.
But for the bulk of it, I think you can do successfully from home.
That's great. So anyone want to start next?
I can go next.
Go for it, Zach.
All right. So for me, my life started, I guess, I dropped out of college originally, joined the military, and then did my time there.
What branch? I have to interrupt.
I was in the Army. Were you in the Army?
I still am. Army National Guard.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
No kidding.
And what did you do in the Army? Just because Zach's a badass and needs to mention that.
I was an Army Ranger.
What? Oh, I am not a badass in the Army. Wow. I'm impressed.
Yeah, I was stationed down in Savannah, Georgia, Heaberlin Army Airfield, 1st Ranger Battalion.
Nice.
I did some time there and then went back to school because I fell in love with medicine during my time in the Army. I loved the trauma training.
Yep.
So that was what really got me interested in medicine. So I busted my ass and got it barely into a college, barely avoided community college after my 0.9 GPA, after dropping out of the University of Colorado. And I managed to pull off a decent GPA and MCAT score and finally got into med school, lucked out, got into the University of Iowa off the wait list, and been kicking butt since. My wife was pregnant through the acceptance phase towards medical school, and that added a lot of uncertainty for us. We weren't really sure where we were going to live. Initially, I thought we were going to be living in Philadelphia, and we had no idea how we were going to live in the big city, probably not in a very safe area with kids. So this was a huge blessing for us to be able to come here and have affordable housing and be at a great program. So that was a huge blessing when we finally figured this out. And then we had to rush and find a place to live. We managed to find a place last minute to move into, and it ended up being great. And so my wife was pregnant all through the summer leading up to school. We had moved out here in June prior to M1 year, and she gave birth. So the white coat ceremony was on a Friday. She went into labor Saturday afternoon. We didn't even think she was really in labor. We had gone to the hospital like 3 times already. We're like, no, you're not in labor. No, you're not in labor. Baby's fine, whatever. And then Saturday afternoon, we're like, you know what? We'll stop in. We have some uncertainty. Maybe your water broke. Maybe it didn't. We'll go to Home Goods after, whatever. And so we went in, and her water broke, and she went into labor. The baby, our oldest, Luke, was born on Sunday morning. Classes started Monday. And so I took one day off because I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what I was allowed to do. And I think the school was very supportive, but I was just a very scared M1, and I had no idea what I wanted or, should be doing. So I was like, I'm going to just go do everything, and kind of threw my wife into the weeds a little bit in the beginning, and just started going to school the next day because I had anatomy and I didn't want to miss that or risk making that up or, avoiding time at school to be at home when I would have to make this up on the back end. So that was a really tough transition, starting medical school and having a baby day one, basically. And so that led to a lot of sleepless nights. I think I hallucinated my way through most of probably the first 2 months. And I really, the only reason I got through was because of the support of my classmates. My anatomy group was spectacular. They got me through our foundations of medical science. I would, sit there during our take-home quizzes and stare blankly and then say stupid things, and they'd be like, okay, Zach, that's a good thought, and they'd tell me the right answer, which was very helpful. So, they were phenomenal, and they carried me through anatomy. And then finally, as my child started sleeping more than an hour at a time, I started to actually okay, I need to know how to function and actually figure this out for myself. So that took some time as well to kind of gear into it. But after that, it got a lot easier. It really did. And as you learn to cope with what you're dealing with, which is very helpful. You kind of, it was very much a sink or swim kind of moment. And I was lucky I was able to rise to the challenge. And we had, the baby was great. We had a great, second semester went super well. I took the whole summer of M1 year off so I could actually spend time with my child that I had been neglecting for the last 9 or so months. So that was awesome. And then we found out right after my son's first birthday, my wife was pregnant again. I don't know how that happened.
I don't know, man.
It just happens.
You
sometimes.
hadn't had that lecture yet.
No, yeah. We hadn't had our OB lectures yet, and so now I know.
Good.
And so now we had another child born in May of 2020, right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and that was a huge amount of uncertainty. Was I going to be allowed at the hospital? Who would be allowed at the hospital? Was anyone going to be allowed to travel to visit us? And so we were really worried about that. So we're from New Jersey originally, and we moved out to Iowa completely. We have no family. We had no friends here. I'm so lucky. I made some great friends. We had a dad squad that we kind of linked up pretty quickly early on, and they were great support through this whole time. And so we had our child during the COVID pandemic, and like Jess was saying, that was a huge blessing in disguise. As tragic as it has been for so many people, that really made things not even just bearable, but excellent. I got to sit in Zoom lectures and hold my newborn all day. I would feed him, I would put him down to sleep. There was no issues. The school let me take a day off just so I could be there for the birth, and I'm sure they would have let me take much more time off. I was still a very nervous M2. So I still just, I'll just jump right back into these Zoom classes. And they were super supportive. I used my newborn son during our PEDS rotation, during doing some exam maneuvers, the Orlutani and Barlow maneuvers. I was, so that was a great way to participate and practice without actually being in the hospital. So I still I feel like a decent education in that. And now we have a 1-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and we've just been thriving. So this is great. And actually, we just found out my wife is pregnant with a third. So
hey, congratulations!
Thank you.
That's awesome.
I couldn't let Nick beat me.
Yeah.
We're going for the hat trick.
Well, that's okay. Sally's got us all beat, but her story's
yeah. One question that kind of came up in the last episode, we were doing some Q&A stuff. Some people had asked, your wife stays at home with your kids. How do you manage finances? Like, are you like a Dogecoin millionaire, or like, what are you doing to pay the bills? How do you take care of that family?
Yeah, so no Dogecoin millionaires yet. Hopefully working towards that. I don't know if people are still buying that, but so I had the GI Bill for the first 2 years, which was very helpful. I had blew through undergrad because I knew what I wanted to do. So I had 2 years of GI Bill left for med school, and there was a fairly generous stipend with that, and so that covered rent and it covered tuition, which was great. And since then, I had some money saved up prior from working. I was in the Army. I saved up some money, and I worked as an EMT and a medical scribe, and was able to save some money before school. We had lived with my wife's parents for probably almost 1.5 years as I was getting med school sorted out. And so that has been very helpful, but now that's all gone. So kind of living off of loans, and I think there's options available that I'm probably going to have to look into about, increasing my loan burden in order to help, continue to support my family. And then I have 1 year left, so hopefully that won't rack up too much of a bill before I get out of here.
Sure. Great. Thanks for that. That's an amazing story. Whenever I think about, having a newborn day one of medical school. I don't know how you did it. Like I was there watching you, and I don't know how you did it, but like it was definitely a wild ride.
You tell me, it was all a blur.
Great. So anyone else want to tell their story?
So, pretty different story. I was a dance and English major. I would be useless in the Army, but I joined a dance company after college and did that for a little while, and found that when that kind of ran its course, I had no direction and no idea what to do with my life. And it actually took me probably another 10 years to figure that out. So in the meantime, we moved to California so my husband could do a PhD, and I was just working at various things. I was a massage therapist for a while. I was a tutor. I did some office work. And we had our first daughter while he was in graduate school. And I guess what I would say about that was actually the hardest, even though I was working not full time at the time, because it's your first child and that can be really rocky and it can be a big identity change going into parenthood when all of a sudden, like, you're on call 24/7 for this very needy, fragile infant. Mm-hmm. And also just luck of the draw, what child you get and whether they sleep and whether they cry all day, which my first one kind of did. So first year was definitely, I would say it's the hardest year of my life, that first year of being a parent. Anyway, so but she's great now. She knows she sleeps through she's 7. She sleeps through the night. Good. It happens eventually for almost all of them. So when we finished graduate school, we were kind of betwixt and between a while, but eventually we ended up in Fort Worth and we had our second child there. And by then I had figured out that I wanted to go to medical school. So while we were in Fort Worth, I started chipping away at prereqs. And we had our second child, our son, and then started applying to medical school. And we knew for sure that we wanted to be somewhere that would be good for families. That really, Texas has its own weird application system. I don't know if any of y'all know about that. So that's like a separate thing unto itself. But beyond that, when I was looking for schools to apply, I was really focused on where could we live well as a family. And I credit the podcast, actually, the Short Coat, for bringing me here, because no, for real. Because I was, on my commute back and forth to Arlington for my classes, I'd be listening to podcasts, and this is one that came up. And I really just loved how friendly everyone seemed and how open, and the vibe that I got. And so when I looked into it further, and that sort of consolidated that for us, and we're so happy living here. I love that from where I live, it seems like everything is 7 minutes in the car. That's a big thing, living lots of places with lots of traffic. It's just, and my daughter runs outside and plays with the friend across the street, and they just run around the neighborhood, and I don't worry about it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, Iowa's great.
Yeah. I don't take it for granted. So, but then I had my third child in January of this year, my first medical school year. So almost very parallel fashion to Jessica, almost exact same timing, except that it was my third and not my first. So I felt like I knew a little bit more what I was getting into, and I just lucked out with this baby. She's a great sleeper. She's very sweet and mellow. But that being said, I think the only reason that I was able to continue with coursework was because of the Zoom. It's a lot to ask a new parent to be juggling in and out of the house and juggling whatever childcare you can cobble together for the first 6 weeks when they can't even go to daycare yet. And so Zoom was definitely a blessing, a huge blessing for me. And even with that additional, as we were talking a little bit before, I'm taking sort of a half credit load. So I'll take 5 years to graduate, and I'm stretching my first, it's a little bit complicated, but I'm stretching the preclinical out an extra year. That just made the most sense for us, because not just having the infant, but also the toddler, who actually takes a lot more time and energy than the infant.
That is definitely fair.
Right? But everybody's doing great, and we've adjusted to Iowa beautifully, and happy ending.
That's great. So wait, how many of us are from Iowa versus not from Iowa?
I grew up in Virginia.
And Zach, you're
from
New Jersey. Jess?
I'm from Florida. My husband's the Iowan.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm Iowa.
Yeah, same here. I'm from Iowa.
But that's a big piece of the puzzle too, right? So not being able to have family here, or not having them here all the time. We weren't sure. You can't keep the grandparents away. They came. So COVID or no COVID, they came.
Oh, yeah.
So that was great. We had my mother-in-law here for a month, and then my parents here for a month, and that helped a lot. But eventually they have to go home, and so
of course,
having that local network is definitely something that we miss.
Yeah, I think that came up a lot in some of the questions that we talked about last episode. With, do you have that support around you? And most med students don't. Even if you are from that state, you know, my parents live 3 hours away from me, so it's not like they're gonna just drive every day to come in and see us. So you're probably gonna have to be prepared to not be in that med school in your hometown where you have all that support.
Listeners, if you ask us a question, it means that I don't have to make something up to talk about on the show, and the show becomes what you want it to be. So send your questions to theshortcoats@gmail.com or leave a message at 347-SHORT-CT. We'll talk about it on the show.
So Sally, do you want to tell us your story?
Yes. So I'm very non-traditional as well. My first career was a high school English teacher. So I did that for 10 years and I loved it. Like I would have been fine with doing that my whole life. I just started to feel, I worked in a lot of urban districts and with a lot of at-risk students. And I just started to feel like, you know, I really wanted to help them, but how much is it helping them to teach them how to write a really good literary analysis of mice and men? You know, I started to see that they had much bigger problems. So a seed started to kind of grow in my mind about going to medical school, because I just felt like, you know, like family medicine, just taking care of their basic medical needs would be a lot more helpful. So I started I also thought it would be fun to teach high school, like chemistry and biology and stuff like that. So I just started taking those classes, because either way, I could either go to med school or I could teach those classes. Either way, it'd be fun. So I started taking those classes and eventually got into medical school. But the parenting part, or the being a mom part of my story, I think is interesting, because I think having kids is kind of what gave me the confidence to go to medical school. I think, so my kids, when I started medical school, were 4, 7, 9, and 10. So I've been a mom for a long time, but I think being able to just empty yourself out, like physically, emotionally, mentally, for the sake of others, is kind of like a natural high. And it also, I think parenting just shows you, like, I mean, earlier we were talking about like sink or swim, you know, like it shows you like what you're capable of.
Yeah.
So after having 4 kids, it was like, okay, now what? Like, I can do amazing things. I can be up all night. I can be at the end of my rope, and I can still like work and do a really good job at that. So like, it was almost like it inspired me to just kind of challenge myself for the sake of others, I guess. Because when people are involved, if you're doing it for people, it's worth it, you know? So my story is a little different, whereas like the kids kind of inspired me to do it in the first place, I guess. So I didn't have any babies while in medical school. My youngest was 4 when I started, and he was already sleeping through the night and potty trained.
Well, it's not too late, Sally. You know, it's not too late.
Yeah. I think it is. I think it's safe to say. But, and like you guys have been saying, classmates, so supportive.
Yeah, definitely.
So kind. And 2 things I'd just like to mention that I think, actually, I feel like I have it easier than people that don't have kids, or it just benefits, I guess, of having kids in medical school, is it forces me to use my time super wisely. Like during preclinicals, I would come in and get there like at 7 or 7:30, and I'd be like, okay, I have until 5 o'clock to get all this stuff done. And I would just like work my butt off and use like every second that I could, so that I could go home and spend time with my kids. And because that was like my reward at the end of the day, you know? So I think that was really helpful. And then another thing that's really helpful is when you have kids, it just puts everything in perspective. Like, you're about to take this test and you're so worried you're going to do horrible and feel so stupid. But then it's like, well, does it really matter? Because, I mean, you just like look at a picture on your phone of one of your cute kids at home, and it's like, okay, who really cares if I do crappy on this test? Like, I have this amazing human. So I think in some ways it helps, and in some ways it makes it easier and keeps me more balanced. And so, yeah, that's my story. And my husband, I have to give a shout out to my husband. He is an elementary principal. He's super good with kids, and he does so much. Like, cooking and cleaning. So you have to have a spouse who's on board, obviously.
It's not an easy job for them. My wife has been staying at home, and I don't envy her. I don't know if that I could do what she's doing. She's tough.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what you said, Sally, and say how now that I'm in clinicals as a mom, since I did practice medicine before medical school, I've been able to see a before and after comparison of how parenting has changed me, even in how I practice. And it's been such a positive experience. I'm so much more empathetic. I see things and can read in between the lines of things that before I was oblivious to. Or like even if just the attending physician is trying to talk to mom about like an informed consent procedure and the child is just like going crazy because they've been stuck in the hospital for 3 hours on a really tough day, I know how to like take that little child aside and just entertain them. And I know some people without kids are already naturally gifted at doing that. I was not one of those. I was a person who didn't know I had a maternal side until I had a child. And so it's definitely made me a different person in my medical practice as well.
Yeah,
I agree.
And if you think about it, it's, you know, so much of what we're trying to learn to do is to really understand the patient's story and their perspective and where they're coming from, even if it's really, really different than your own. And that's pretty much life with a toddler. Like they have their own, like they are little alien creatures who are coming from a totally different place that you are. But if you want to work together and work with them, you have to be able to that's your job as the parent. It's not their job to explain it to you. It's your job to figure it out so that you can help them move past it or, you know, resolve the situation or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and that's a learning curve. I'm still working on that. It's hard.
I don't think I would have ever understood until having kids myself. Like, toddlers are monsters.
They're magical monsters.
Magical monsters, yes. Love them to death.
People talk about difficult patients, and I'm like, I don't really get it, I guess. Because I'm just so used to dealing with difficult. I mean, after the toddler years, like, nobody's difficult compared to that, you know, like, whatever. They're a little bit demanding, you know. And
they're not bad. They're just, you know, I love that. What's that line? Children do well if they can. And I think I sort of like try to take that perspective on people in general. Like, people get into emotional places and they get stuck, just like adults do this too. It's not just it's not just people who are sick, and it's not just children. Like, grown adults, we do this all the time too.
And those are the patients that we give up on a little premature, I think.
Or the colleagues, for that matter. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think, you know, kids for me have really made me more interested in things that are pediatric. Like, I'm not going into pediatrics, but I enjoyed my pediatric rotation. I enjoy the pediatric portions of other rotations. And, you know, that's not something I would be at all interested in prior to having kids. I've always thought kids were fine, but, you know, I think they definitely change you and change who you are and how you think. And they're definitely blessings. I know you all told your story, and if you all want to hear my story, I told it on the last podcast. I have 3 kids. I have a newborn at home, and part of this podcast is part of an elective that I'm doing. And we might even talk a little bit more about that. We won't go too in depth because it was also discussed in the last podcast. So check out that last podcast.
Today's show is sponsored by Panacea Financial, a company founded by 2 doctors who were frustrated as medical trainees that banks didn't seem to understand their unique needs in the medical field. So they built a company just for medical students and doctors. With nationwide digital banking, Panacea Financial provides medical students with free checking that includes no ATM fees nationwide, high-yield savings accounts, a free personal banker, around-the-clock customer support, with loans designed with you in mind. No one should borrow more than they need. But with Panacea Financial, 4th-year medical students can get money as needed in as little as 24 hours with their PRN personal loan. What's PRN stand for?
As needed.
Yeah. And why is it what PRN? Is it Latin?
Oh, I think it is. It's Latin something.
It's like Pro Renata. Pro Renata?
Yeah. Hang on.
Look at AJ Googling.
AJ's
well, I mean, look. He's got all that free time living with his parents. So.
And I went, oh yeah, it just
you're being
whatever.
pimped on Latin.
Pro Renata.
That's what he said.
Oh well.
Instead of running
I
up,
didn't hear. I was too busy Googling myself.
Instead of running up credit card debt Try their PRN personal loan that is designed to give you a better way to cover expenses such as residency applications and relocation or board exams. Some customers actually use it to pay off toxic credit card debt. In addition, medical students can have a period of no or reduced payment on their PRN personal loan. Join the growing number of medical students and physicians nationwide that expect more from their bank. Go to panaceafinancial.com today to open your free account. Panacea Financial is a division of Primis, member FDIC.
Ooh.
Why don't we move along into another show topic? So, somewhere between 7 and 10% of medical students end medical school as parents. And some of them come in, like you heard, some of us came into medical school with kids. Others have kids along the way. Definitely a challenge. And I think with changing demographics, we're seeing more and more older students and more women in medical school. And that's really going to change this conversation more and more as we keep moving along. So what I want to talk about is how medical schools can support medical students, how medical schools are already supporting medical students, and in general, just a little bit about some of the research around this topic of parenting in medical school. And I know, Jess, you have done a lot of work in this area. You've done some research on your own. You've read the literature that's out there. And I'm wondering if you'd just like to talk a little bit to some of that and we can kind of get a conversation going on what's going on in that arena.
Yeah, and then feel free to fact check me and
Sure.
jump in since you have papers in front of you as well. Yeah, so I became interested in this when I started looking into our policies. Actually, I started looking into policies when I found out I was pregnant before starting school. So every school I applied to, I would look. And then I got curious and started looking at maybe the ones I wasn't applying to just for comparison. And so that's when I got this idea of pursuing this as a research topic because there was absolutely no standardization. It was totally unpredictable. Some places had no policies. I found hardly any that had fantastic policies. And so then I formally approached that research project with a classmate of mine. A shout out to Brad Fleming. And I also have a couple physicians I'm working with, Dr. Franklin Dexter, Dr. Amy Pearson. We are doing some research on this now. I can't discuss in detail because it's not yet published, but I can do a review of the literature of the things we've been looking at. And so really, when I did a literature review of the topic last summer, I could only find one paper that talked about this issue for medical students specifically. Mm-hmm. And it was out of South Dakota School of Medicine. Mm-hmm. So it was just a small single institution survey for medical students there. And really everything else in the literature had to do with residents, had to do with attendings who are staffing medical schools. And there's hundreds of publications on them, or I should say at least in the tens, maybe not quite over 100 yet. But I remember I got at least over 100 hits that I looked at and only found one at that time. Now there has been since a few more. And what the South Dakota survey looked at was just asking students, hey, what elements do you think should be included? I mean, and some of it's just so basic. You would think it's common sense, but you still don't really find it in a lot of institutional policies. How a student can arrange for maternity, paternity leave, how much time a student can take off and still graduate with their class, how the student and school jointly devise a plan to make up required courses missed during the leave, how to request additional accommodations or flexibility for breastfeeding if it interferes with their expected activities. Does the plan for communicating the policy to students exist? How are they doing it? Just because it's in your online policy doesn't even mean that staff and coordinators and definitely students are aware of it, And what was interesting is sometimes you find it, sometimes you don't, you have to find the right thing to Google. And then the last two other items that were mentioned of importance in that South Dakota survey was a statement that the school wishes to be supportive of pregnancy and parenthood in medical students, and that they should have resources available for mental health counseling. I think that's important for males who are dads, but also definitely women in that postpartum period we know can be very difficult. So those are items of great importance that I think we need to take a look into. And there have been a call just recently, like you brought to my attention, like since I did my literature review last summer, there's been a few things published just this spring. A couple. One was a study that looked at all 199 med schools, MD and DO, and out of those 199, they could only find 65, so like 33%, that had parental leave policies available, at least from what they could see online in the handbook. Doesn't mean that like maybe they don't have case by case situations they allow for those students. And also interesting, the majority of those were DO. It was like 60% DO, 25% MD. So I think it really is telling about the culture of medicine right now. And interestingly enough, too, if you look at the AAMC graduation questionnaire data, as the percentage of female students increases, the percentage of graduating students with dependents has decreased. And I haven't been able to go back. That data really only goes till, was it like 2015, 2016? So I could only look at like the past few years and then maybe like one other shot I had saw some data from, but I would like to look at like a very continuous comparison of that. And I don't know how much of it is even statistically significant or not. It was just an observation I made recently looking online. I was like, oh, is that because as more women are entering medicine, it's becoming harder to do that during our childbearing years, and so we're putting it off, and so you're going to have less graduating med students who are parents as more and more of them are female. And why is that? Is it just because they don't feel supported? They don't know how to do it? Is it just a cultural shift? Maybe we're more career minded, I think all of the above is true. We're getting married later, we're having babies later. So I would say there's still quite a dearth of literature out there. I would say most of the articles you read are saying like, we need more extensive research on this. You know?
Definitely.
And then did you want to talk about some of the solutions now, or were there other things that you found as well addressing the problems of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really that there isn't enough out there. We don't know enough because we haven't had good surveying medical students for what they really feel and what they need and how they best think they can be supported. So I think that's one clear message that we need to take away, is that, there's something going on. Students are having fewer kids in medical school, and we don't know why, and we also don't. It's definitely difficult, and we don't know how they feel they need to be best supported, and it's also very clear that the policies aren't there. So we can talk a little bit about some of those solutions if you want. Well, I feel like I just said a whole bunch of stuff that was like basically what you said. So.
No, well, that's okay, because we always need to hear something more than once before we really retain it. So that's totally
executive
fine.
Summary is what you just did.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. Before we go on, I did most of the talking. Is there anything else you guys wanted to add to that?
Well, I haven't looked at the research at all, so that's very interesting. I just my experience of other institutions is just from my Facebook medical school moms, I think it's called, where you hear some real horror stories. So
that's another great point, is that I was finding, I've actually even had a medical editor tell me, and I will not say which one, oh, this issue has been studied at length. And, it's already out there, and like totally conflated that most of that research was on residents, right, and physicians. And then it's like you go on to Student Doctor Network, like I did before I started med school, like pregnant, medical, starting med school, pregnant. And there's just blogs after blogs after blogs. Like there is interest, there is concern. Definitely. It's like, why is it just, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg really in the literature. Yeah.
Yeah, and in the last podcast we talked a little bit about how things are changing for residency programs, where there is a defined leave policy that's starting this year, but that still doesn't impact medical students. And I think that's the clear distinction, that we just haven't done this work for medical students yet. And it's clear that the leave policies aren't there, including the University of Iowa doesn't have a defined parental leave policy. So
we have a great breastfeeding one, though.
Yes, yeah, the breastfeeding policy.
I don't know how that happens. You just immediately go to breastfeeding. But
that's great. They're with the majority of MD schools that doesn't have that policy. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about some of the solutions, and I kind of want to throw it to the group too. You know, what are some things that you think would be helpful? We have some papers that have been written that I can, you know, definitely read off some of their thoughts, but what would you all find helpful as medical students? And what are some of the things that you've even experienced here that you're just, you know, you were surprised that was available and it seems very helpful? And I can start that out. You know, I talked about it at length in the last episode, but right now I'm on an elective where it's called Family Caregiving Transitions, where I'm able to work on a project independently on my time, and I get to spend the rest of my time with my family. And it's been a great experience to spend the last month, you know, getting to know my new little one at home, and that's a great opportunity. And I think that's something that most med schools should look at. You know, how can we get some of those electives where students can, you know, work on their time when it's most convenient for them, so that they can be home with their kids and even, you know, if they have other caregiving situations that they need to be involved with. Any other thoughts on some things that you've liked here at CCOM, or even some things that you think would be more helpful?
So for me, like, I didn't look or ask or anything about the policies just because I had so much anxiety about starting med school. And I had some, you know, very helpful emails like, please let us know if you need anything. But it's so vague that I didn't even know what I could ask for, and I was definitely afraid to ask being a new student. So if there was like some kind of policy, I definitely didn't even look for it, which would have been smart, but that would have been helpful. If there was a little more guidance, like, hey, you're allowed this much time, or you're allowed this much leeway, you know, that would have been super helpful. But honestly, it didn't become a big issue. Like, even through clinicals, all the staff were very supportive. Like, oh yeah, please let us know if you need any time. I'm like, oh, well, I'll just take this day off, and, you know, that I should be fine after that. And they're like, okay, but let us know if you need more. Like, we're here to support you. You can make it up whenever. So everyone has been super friendly and super helpful and super supportive in that way. There's just no real definitive, you know, this is super helpful, except in the absence policy. Something that is great is it's worded in a way that pretty much says you're almost guaranteed to get time off for like family medical appointments. Mm-hmm. So it's almost forces like course directors to give you time off if you have kids' doctor's appointments, which is super helpful during COVID because you can't have more than one or two people at a doctor's appointment. So I'm able to stay home and watch one of the kids, or go to the appointment with one of the kids while my wife or I watch the other one. So that's been very helpful to kind of be able to step away and actually make it to those appointments. But other than that, you know, something more definitive like Jess was talking about would be fantastic.
I think part of the reason for a lack of policy is the understanding that each situation is very different, and having a baby during your preclinical is different, where there's more flexibility perhaps during the clinical years. Your family situation is different, whether you're depending on loans is different, because it's going to change whether you can afford to take time off school. If if your loans get cut off because you take time off of school, then that's a problem potentially. So I can understand it from that point of view. But I also, one thing I heard when I was sort of trying to gather information before my third was born this past January was, well, you know, you're not the first to have a baby and you won't be the last in medical school. And that's true. But if that's absolutely true. But if that's true, why does it feel like I'm reinventing the wheel? So if, you know, some kind of centralized either written thing or a point person, like here's the person in the student counseling center that you go to, and they understand sort of all the different pieces of this puzzle and how to get you the information that's relevant to your situation.
Yeah. I mean, and even the elective that I'm on right now, it was almost an afterthought. I was in the office, you know, getting my schedule changed, saying like, hey, I'm doing this because I have a baby coming and I'm going to have to arrange something for this month. And a few days later, I got this email. Hey, actually, you're going to be eligible for this clerkship. And it's like, oh, I've never heard of this before. Like, what is this clerkship? Wow. And so, you know, it's definitely not something that's just available for us to see at this point. It's great that, some of these resources are there, but if they were in a more defined area, I think that would be much easier for students to find.
Yeah. So I think all of our observations are confirming, like, people do want to help you.
Yeah.
They do want to be supportive and sympathetic and help you get through this process. No one's saying, like, don't have a child, right?
Yep.
It's more so this nonverbal, like, why isn't there a process in place that gives you anxiety about how to proceed? But like, when you go on a case by case basis, I've had a similar experience where I have found people have been so willing, like, oh yeah, I overheard my conversation on the phone with my child's babysitter. Oh, do you need to go? Just go home. It's fine. Like, I would have never asked to go, but they're just like very supportive and understanding because many of them are parents too. And so I think that individuals within our medical institutions do want to help. Mm-hmm. We just need to collaboratively get together and create more of a formalized policy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really what a lot of us are dealing with. That it's there, but how do we actually interact with what our options are, and how do we discover what they are? And it's like so many things in life, right or wrong. A lot of times, you need to be the one who's really advocating for yourself in so many aspects of your life, asking the questions to the people who are in charge. How can I get this, whatever it is? And, if you're a parent, it's, how can I get this time with my family? How can I get away? What accommodations can you make in this specific situation? You have to be your own advocate. And I think that's very true as a parent, because generally speaking, nobody's going to just say, oh, here, you can just leave, go, see you later. If I have a kid with a doctor's appointment, I'm going to have to ask, like, hey, I need to get away. Like, if I have something come up last minute, I'm going to have to advocate for myself, even if I just need time, or, if we have a counseling center, if you need, mental health services, things like that, you have to ask for those things. And maybe it could be better in a policy somewhere, but you also do have to kind of take some ownership of that.
You do have to be your best advocate. Absolutely. Yeah. For your sake and the sake of your family.
All right. So anybody else have any other thoughts on, ways that you feel you could be better supported?
I have a few thoughts. So I do think that it is important to have policies specific for parents in medical school, because I think they're so used to, I've had the same thing where people say to me, just let us know if there's anything you need, we're here for you. But I think it's so easy for them to be so used to the typical medical student. And so the typical medical student, when they ask for time off, it's for a wedding. And I'm past like the wedding phase of life. Like, all my friends already got married, so I don't need time off for weddings. But it seems like my classmates, like, if they have a wedding on a weekend, it's like so easy for them to get like a Friday off so they can go to this wedding, because it's so typical. And that's just what they're used to at CCOM for, approving absences. I asked in the whole 1.5 years of preclinicals, I asked to be gone one time, and it was denied. So I just felt like, and it had to do with more adulting than, going to, not that I'm bitter that people are going to weddings, but like, I needed to go out of town to refinance our house so that we had more money for medical school. So it was like and they didn't approve that. And it was the only time I'd ever asked. So I feel like everybody means well, but when they aren't used to the type of request, they're not used to people asking, to be gone for their kids, or, to do these things that maybe people 10 years older are going to be needing. So in that sense, I feel like there almost does need to be a policy like, no, if people are asking for this, you have to approve it, because it's just as important as someone who's in an earlier season of life and wants to go to a friend's wedding, So I think you can advocate for yourself, but in my case, did it once and it didn't work. So I think there have to be some policies to back you up as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There was a great article called A Timely Problem, Parental Leave During Medical Training by Allison Webb and some other authors. It talked about some great options that medical schools could take on. And I think some of these really fall in line with what we've experienced through COVID. So they talked about having some more online learning platforms, maybe also asynchronous modules with video-based instruction. I think that would be super easy after COVID because, everybody was recording all of their lectures for everything and sending them out. Electives that accommodate telecommuting, so maybe something like the elective that I'm on right now, and also other parent-friendly electives with flexible schedules that kind of integrate some of the personal and professional needs of the learner. One thing that I really like that they talked about competency-based medical education. So focusing more on like the proficiency of one's skills versus the amount of time practicing them. So, you would have the learner evaluated on being able to do something like, I don't know, let's say like sutures or whatever. If that student was able to show that they could do it, then, they didn't have to attend whatever lecture. That's a great way, I think, to make it more flexible for parents. Also, they really advocated for flexibility in the graduation requirement timeline. So like, I think of this as when you need to have your board exams completed, when you need to have certain required coursework completed. Zach and I are looking at fourth year right now, and especially with COVID, we get extra time off compared to normal medical school. But even normally we get 16 weeks off in a year that doesn't have anything to do with COVID. Some of that's for taking exams, some of that's for doing interviews and whatnot. But a lot of that is just time off. Like you can take your vacations or whatever. And that seems like a great time to make up a lot of missed work from medical school. So the time's there, especially for medical students. I can see where it could be more difficult for residents, but the time's there for medical students. And I think that, we could be more flexible in allowing students to get work done, get requirements done later. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that this article had. Any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I do want to just play devil's advocate real quick and say, I think you would get pushback since this article was still more so geared towards residents. Yeah. Especially the CBME part. And I feel like that's the pushback that I've heard and read is that, well, these rules don't apply to you. And I think some of that inherent in that logic is the notion that you're less mature than a resident as a medical student. And I mean, yeah, if maybe you're nothing against traditional students, maybe if you're 22 years old and you've never been out on your own, like maybe you have a little less maturity than a 35-year-old who's had like 3 homes and 5 kids or whatever. But I think some of that is a little bit of ageism. It's like really subtle. It's not anything I can highlight and say this is where exactly, but that's what it has come across to me as like I'm getting lumped in with all of my peers, like Sally said, who are in kind of a different stage of life and they're accustomed to that. But then these recommendations in this article you mentioned, I would say, well, we can do competence-based medical examinations for them because they've, are at a different stage of training than you. And I don't know, for me, it's always just been like, tell me if I want to just be examined for what I know now, not how long I'm sitting in a room, because I have found that can be an incredibly inefficient process at times. And I would just rather like do it in my own way and then show up and take the exam. And if I fail the exam, that's on me. That's on me. And I will happily repeat whatever thing you want me to do, So I just wonder if that's why some of these options that they've mentioned for residents have not yet begun to flourish in our circles yet. What are your thoughts?
I think it's always hard to just make a change culturally. I'm thinking one thing I've thought a lot about is, and it may exist other places, but I heard about it, that for residency actually at UCSF, they have an extended program. So for a long time, the mantra was, well, you have to do it this way because that's the way you get the best education. Well, UCSF decided they could give you just as good training, spreading it out over more years with fewer hours per week. And what's really fascinating about that to me is that obviously that is appealing to parents, but they don't limit it to parents. So I actually heard about it because there was a physician musician. She has a band And so that's what she does with her
Wow.
her extra 10 hours a week or whatever.
That's amazing.
And they gave her you have to apply to it. You don't just like, check a box or whatever, but they gave her the okay to do that. And so I think that's an example of a way that you can stretch your minds just a little bit about, what it means to be well trained and how you get there.
Yeah, and there are different models for different medical schools. I mean, even our medical school, we do a year and a half of preclinical work, whereas, the traditional is 2. And you have other medical schools that you graduate in 3 years. So obviously there's room to tweak the timeline, and we're still pumping out doctors and they're all moving on to residency. So, there may be more than one way that we can manage, medical education and make it more inclusive for more people. And I think having those options is definitely a great idea.
Did you come across any international medical school literature that blew your mind? I saw some things, but I didn't find any novel models on this. Maybe I just missed it.
There was a really good study. I might be stretching my memory here, but there was a good study from the UK from like 10 years ago. And I don't know that it was really remarkable. I'm shuffling through papers to see if it's actually here, but I was reading what it said, and I was thinking, wow, I think if you plopped what these thoughts are, and you just told me, hey, this study was an American study that was taken, last week, and all this data was from last week, I would probably be like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. So I don't know that much has changed, between the UK and the US over the last 10 years. Yeah. So the study from the UK said that 6.9% of medical students or their partners have been pregnant during medical school, or 7.5 total of the respondents had children. 23% said that they delayed children because of medical school, and 7.5% said that they chose not to have students because of studying medicine. And 77.6% of respondents think that studying medicine affects the decision to become a parent. So, and they talk about time constraints, financial pressures. And so this is a UK study, but I think a lot of those themes are some of the things that you'd expect here. Struggles finding time to study, social impacts of, your social life. I mean, I definitely feel that as a parent. I don't know about your all's social life, but mine is. I think as a medical student, you have very little social life sometimes, and throwing a parenthood on that definitely impacts things.
Yeah, I pretty much just hang out with my kids and my wife.
Yeah,
and Nick every other month.
Yeah, we get together every other month and see how things are going. Run into people in the hospital. That's about it. That's my social life. So, for sure.
I found one other study from Brazil that came out last year. But they did it comparing medical students and law students.
Yeah, I saw that study as well.
Just for listeners, family planning among female medical students, are their plans comparable to other professions or professionals? And you have to get it translated into English unless you read Portuguese. But yeah, so they found that their medical students compared to their law students tended to, if they did do pregnancies, go through them later. And that those that chose, there was like, they asked the question, do you just not want to have children at all? And most of those that answered yes, there wasn't a large percentage. It was like 12 to 16%, something in there. I mean, maybe larger than in America, perhaps. But of those, most of those were surgical medical students, like planning on doing the surgical track. So they found that it was pretty revolved around whether that person wanted to do a surgical career if they had a late pregnancy or a pregnancy at all. I mean, so yeah, like you said, it doesn't sound much different than the issues we're dealing with here. And this is just data that was published recently.
Yeah, I think the reality is medicine is difficult. It's a very demanding career. It asks a lot of us as, budding doctors. And regardless, you're going to make sacrifices. And some of that's going to include sacrificing time with family. Whether that's good or not, I think we can make it better. But I think there's always going to be a sense of that because you're entering into a career where self-sacrifice is part of the game. We have the sense of altruism where, we're here to help people. And some of that helping others is going to be at the expense of ourselves. And there's always going to be a sense of that. I think we can make it better so that we don't always have to go through so much difficulty for us and our families. But it's an intense career that's high stakes, and part of it is we chose to be here. So there is a sense where we have to somewhat live with some of that decision.
I think that's absolutely true, but that's one reason why when you're still a medical student and no one's really depending on you much yet, that's why this is actually a good time. Possibly easier for the parent as opposed to residency. Certainly easier on the colleagues to not have somebody go missing. So, I mean, the more that schools can do to make it easier for, not everybody's even ready, right? You haven't found your partner yet, or you don't want to do it by yourself. But the more that schools can do to help people who want to have their families earlier, then they'll be ready to show up and hit the ground running in residency.
Very true.
Win-win.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about that in the last show, that, medical school is a time with more flexibility than you're going to have any other time in your medical training. So, take advantage of that, I guess. Definitely. Any other thoughts?
I agree. It's definitely, you have to be responsible for yourself and the decisions you make. And, knowing that I did decide to continue to go into med school, having a child, I knew there would be additional challenges associated with it. And, you do have to kind of conform to some degree with the curriculum that is required, regardless of what, you're doing. The school has to teach a certain amount of things because they are required to for, accreditation purposes. So they have to, show that they're educating their students, to some degree. And so there's probably a nice balance that we're not quite at yet. I think there's a great start with like having policies, for family leave and having some makeup policies available to that. You can't just go willy-nilly, hey, show up when you want. Don't show up when you don't want. You still have a responsibility to the material and a responsibility to be a good doctor. So.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's our show. Sally, Katie, Jess, Zach, thanks for joining me. And thank you, Shortcoats, for taking the time to listen to me ramble on. If you like what you heard here today, subscribe to our show. Our editors for the show is me, but normally it's AJ Chowdhury and Eric Bozart. Alex Belzar is our marketing coordinator. This show is made possible by a generous donation by the Carver College of Medicine student government and ongoing support from the Writing and Humanities program. Our music is by Dr. Vox and Catmosphere. I'm Nick Lind. Good luck chasing your kids around. We'll talk to you in 1 week.
That was fun.
Yeah.
Great
Thank
job.
you. Thanks, guys.
Hi, Shortcoats. Look, life in medical education, life in America, life in the world is often difficult. And I often wish I could help. All I have is this podcast, but in my wildest dreams, you have the support you need to lead a life of your choosing. You deserve to be happy, healthy, and successful in whatever ways you define those words. So if you need support because you've experienced racism, discrimination, harassment, mental health crises, I want you to be able to get the help that you need. And so I'm going to put some links in the show notes to some resources that you can use. But the bottom line is that for what it's worth, I see you. I know you're out there. I wish I could do more. Maybe I can in ways that I don't understand yet or know about. But I see you, and I'm glad you're here, and other people are too.